In the process of doing research for a book on Harlem, I immersed myself in cultural production, so novels, films, music, and the like, because I was interested in the sorts of stories that were told about Harlem and the ways that those stories reflected, invented, and shaped social experience of the place. I was particularly struck by a 1975 film, Aaron Loves Angela. In this film, it's not a particularly well-known film, but maybe some of you have seen it. In this film, two teenagers, a young Puerto Rican woman and an African-American man, fall in love in Harlem. Directed by Gordon Parks Jr., who made the classic blaxploitation film Superfly just a few years earlier, race is front and center in the story, though here it was portrayed a bit differently. It was cast into a broader sea of representations and dialogues about a place. The opening sequence panned over the dilapidated streets of a number of Harlem neighborhoods, while featuring a soundtrack of Jose Feliciano singing El Negro. Aquí viene el negro, mulata. Here comes the black man, mulata. Thematizing this, as so many Romeo and Juliet stories of star-crossed lovers, is an apparently uncrossable divide. For Aaron and Angela, Puerto Ricanness and African-American blackness became the fields for navigating romantic difficulty. And ethnicity in this film corresponded to spatial divides of East and West Harlem. So here were these spatial sites, these spaces, East and West, and racial divides, that corresponded also to a split in a scholarship on Harlem, too. So people work on West Harlem, or East Harlem, or Black Harlem, or Puerto Rican Harlem. But there was also a story of what it meant to step across those borders. And it is that story in all its fullness and complexity, and by that I mean solidarity as well as conflict, that I have sought to capture in my larger project. As I explain some of that work, I want to speak about cross-cultural encounter as an important way to think about what Harlem means. What does this move entail, and what is at stake in speaking of Harlem as cross-cultural? Are questions I want to pose here and hopefully engage with the participants of this seminar. As I offer sort of a brief reading of a memoir by Perry Thomas entitled Down These Mean Streets, and a short mention of another Harlem resident I think is important, Yuri Kochiyama. These figures and their cultural and political investments in Harlem serve as a window onto the different sorts of exchanges and projections that have made Harlem what it is, a vital, rich place for racial formation, complex community solidarities and dialogues, as well as disagreements, and diversity. But this proposal of diversity and multiplicity is not the same one that capitalist gentrification produces and promotes. Gentrifiers' advocates, rather disingenuously, utilize the language of multiculturalism, suggesting that having different peoples moving in makes for a more diverse place. And this is why I suppose I'm a bit wary of the language of multiculturalism, because I think multiculturalism is actually being utilized by gentrifiers to promote a particular vision of development. Harlem is many things to many people. World capital of blackness, quintessential urban ghetto, site of multiple historical or contemporary diasporas, Puerto Rican, Italian, Jewish, Mexican, West Indian, African, and most importantly perhaps, the heart of African Americans' political struggles over race and class. Almost like no other one city space, Harlem is about difference writ large. And small, in terms of both division as well as solidarity. On the one hand, ghetto, and on the other, barrio, Harlem can tack productively among the paradigmatic U.S. frameworks of race, ethnicity, and class. Multiplicity, then, is built into the symbol and experience of Harlem, and it is productive to understand that. So what a close look at what I prefer to call the cross-cultural rather than multicultural encounters of Harlem illuminates are the ways that the complex back and forth between different peoples, similarly disenfranchised by the state, can construct vital urban cultures. Meaning, of course, that Harlem residents don't need to be told what diversity is. They live it, engage with it every day, and the social space of Harlem is built through an understanding of diversity's difficulties and diversity's promises. And in proposing the model of cross-cultural encounter, I intend not to take away from the crucial fact that Harlem is a central symbol of global blackness. In fact, what I argue through the work that I'm doing is that Harlem's blackness, both in terms of cultural investments and political struggles, has too been constructed by cross-cultural encounter, the intimate coming together of all sorts of differences and projections for movements to achieve political, cultural, and social freedoms. I think here we can talk about Malcolm X and what he was able to mobilize in terms of transnational and cross-cultural connections, developing a deeply rooted claim on the discourse of multiplicity, that it's not about a sort of integration that serves the middle and upper classes, might enable us to speak of the interest and investments in Harlem for another response to gentrification. The sign under which the memoir that I'm going to speak about briefly operates down these mean streets is mobility. Down these mean streets, there's this sort of continuous sense that the protagonist and author, Perry Thomas, is walking the streets and taking in neighborhoods and taking in experiences and crossing over. And that's something I want to elaborate on. The back of the book, and I'm now wishing that I had signed it for this class, but the back of the book reads, 30 years ago, Perry Thomas made literary history with his lacerating lyrical memoir of his coming of age on the streets of Spanish Harlem. So this is the kind of back cover of the book, and it's what structures the book as a cultural artifact, right? So you expect really the book to be all about Spanish Harlem and life in Spanish Harlem, particularly because there's a kind of training in the literary canon that there are works on Spanish Harlem and there are works on Black Harlem, and they're very, very different in terms of what they can communicate and the sorts of communities that they describe. And to a certain extent, the point I'm making about what's on the back of the book participates in this dichotomy. The lines of the regions of East and West Harlem, again, seem to be quite unporous, at least until the book is cracked open. But what becomes clear upon a close reading of the text is a sort of imaginary of Harlem that's more broadly rendered, that seeks to capture something broader about the place of Harlem. East, West, Central Harlem, Black, Spanish Harlem, something actually more holistic. The totality of the place is made vivid through cross-cultural dialogues, even when structured by questions of blackness. What is deeply compelling in terms of reading this text now is how this 1967 text, its interpretation of a set of historical experiences and imaginings, is so deeply resonant of the ethnographic present, of gentrification and the stories of the world that gentrification has mobilized, in which belonging is vexed and at risk. Perry Thomas in 1967 takes on the regional and racial divides of Harlem. Even in the present, the traversal of Harlem segments, those Central, West, East regions, and the ethnic communities therein is rare. Many, if not most, residents of several neighborhoods profess a lack of familiarity with the others. Even some community workers and intellectuals either know very little about demographic trends that contribute to Harlem's growing or historic diversity, or have shockingly few forms of contact with members of groups other than those they are directly associated with. Perry Thomas's bird's eye view, on the other hand, is, I would say, self-consciously cosmopolitan. In the prologue, he speaks from and into a vast geography. Quote, "Hey world, here I am. This is a bright mundo. My streets, my barrio de noche." End quote. The world that Thomas speaks of is simultaneously local and global, inside and outside. Borders are evident, though frequently crossed, as the book sections are titled, respectively, Harlem, Suburbia, Down South, Harlem, Prison, and New York Town. The repetition makes explicit both Thomas's divided geographic experience and compulsions to go back to Harlem. But the breaks, down south and to prison, open him up to finally collapse Harlem into a broader imaginary of New York town. Harlem's meaning, then, is made not only in its local context, but also in and through its very circulation. Here, then, life in Harlem can illuminate more universal dilemmas about what it means to live in the world. Thomas is engaging with a broader debate about modernity, putting Harlem into the center of those conversations, as other African American writers have done. In the narrative, Thomas tackles complex questions of belonging and membership in the neighborhoods of Harlem. He says, quote, "Sometimes you don't fit in, like if you're a Puerto Rican on an Italian block." But Thomas, perhaps because he writes before the multicultural script for diversity has become hegemonic, is able to evoke these sorts of alternating forms of intimacy and distance in a tense turf-controlling exchange. And I want to quote a little bit at length here. "Someone called, 'Hey, you spick.' I turned around real slow and found my face pushing in the finger of an Italian kid about my age. 'Hey you,' he said, 'what nationality are you?' I looked at him and wondered which nationality to pick. And one of his friends said, 'Aw, Rocky, he's black enough to be a nigger.' 'Ain't that what you is, kid?' My voice was almost shy in its anger. 'I'm Puerto Rican,' I said. 'I was born here.' I looked around for some friendly faces belonging to grown-up people, but the elders were all busy yakking away in Italian. I couldn't help thinking how much like Spanish it sounded. Shit, that should make us something like relatives." As Thomas looks around for support in this confrontation, he notes, quote, "I dug 3 Italian elders looking at us from across the street, and I felt saved. But that went out the window when they just smiled and went on talking. I couldn't decide whether they had smiled because this new whatever he was going to get his ass kicked, or because they were pleased that their kids were welcoming." End quote. The world that Perry inhabits is an intensely diverse one. In a poignant scene in the welfare office, and it's the depression for some portion of this book, young Peary sees clear disadvantage and the humiliation of place through a lens constructed by relatively broad understandings of race, those that cross region and particularized ethnicity. He observes, quote, "Most of the people were Puerto Rican and Negroes. A few were Italians. It seemed that every mother had brought a kid to interpret for her." Here, African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Italians are all incapable of being understood, in a sense, being seen. Likewise, no group can properly read the state. They need another generation to translate. Shared interests are constructed through class disadvantage and encompass racial specificities to create new meanings for difference. Inasmuch as the state racializes its subject populations, for this moment, there is perhaps a shared racial category among Puerto Ricans, African Americans, and Italians, for this moment. I think it's very important that we pay attention to this world that Perry Thomas represents, and ask what these historical and contemporary moments of differential, but perhaps at times also shared racialization among different groups of people might mean for how we understand Harlem as a place for otherness of all kinds. A place whose special meaning lies in its ability to contain that kind of diversity and make of it something that has a broader claim on the popular imagination. A site that many peoples have been forced to go to because they had nowhere else, and which they began to call home. Piri Thomas makes it very clear in his book that he is at home in Harlem, not just Spanish Harlem, but Harlem. Just as Claude McKay's famous African-American protagonist Jake was in Home to Harlem. When Piri is in Long Island at a high school dance, Piri is asked by a white girl, quote, "Are you Spanish?" "I didn't know. I mean, you don't look like what I thought a Spaniard looks like." Piri replied, "I ain't a Spaniard from Spain. I'm a Puerto Rican from Harlem." She says, "Oh, you talk English very well." "I told you I was born in Harlem. That's why I ain't got no Spanish accent." The girl then goes on to compare Piri's accent to another African-American boy's accent. And it is there that Piri is able to comprehend not only what is going on with his own subjectivity, because the autobiography memoir is a kind of search for the self, right? Like most autobiographies are. And he's really searching for a racial self in the text. So when this girl says this, he kind of has this sort of eureka moment about the cross-cultural processes of life in Harlem. He says, "Yeah, I know Jerry," I said softly. "I know Jerry's colored, and I know I got his accent. Most of us in Harlem steal from each other's language or style or stick of living." End quote. Piri Thomas, in fact, powerfully embodies both cross-cultural experience and racial desire. His narrative begins with an assertion of blackness, largely because he is affiliated with the space of Harlem. For Thomas, to be a part of Harlem is to be recognized by and recognizable within that very much desired space to be black. And Thomas recognizes a blackness within, born of a white Puerto Rican mother and a black Cuban father who both claim whiteness. He is at pains to make his own blackness seen within a familial space and to convince his family of their own blackness, located as they are in a suburban space that does not offer those languages for subjectivity. See, his family originally lives in Spanish Harlem and then moves out to the suburbs. And once they move out to the suburbs, they really become white. And so that's when he starts to have all these conflicts and keeps going back to Harlem, because that's where he feels his self can be found. And it's a black self that can be found in Harlem. Moments of intense alienation, particularly vis-a-vis his father, whose affection he desperately seeks, in Thomas's family's new place of residence in Long Island, are counterposed to lyrical descriptions of feeling at home in Harlem. And when Thomas feels at home, he moves to occupy the central production of meaning in Harlem writ large, to refuse to remain on the periphery in East Harlem. So the point I want to make here, in this autobiography on supposedly about East Harlem, the main portion of the text is really about him moving to Black Harlem, to Central Harlem. If there is a narrative thrust, then it is in Piri Thomas's locating himself by the end of the book simultaneously in blackness and Puerto Ricanness and a state of belonging to Harlem. Well before more critical languages of multiplicity, those ones that we're so familiar with, Piri Thomas in 1967 produced a place and a sense of race a good deal more complex than any simple association of delimited racial content and geography. The placement of this text within canonical literatures is a key to some of the broader issues I've been discussing. Rather than a memoir about race, this has become an ethnic text. Rather than a story about Harlem, it is a lyric on Spanish Harlem. And as minoritized aesthetics are discussed in terms of Latino aesthetics and not black aesthetics. Strangely, even for this text, which is all about race, the ethnic self is counterposed to the racial self. But reading down these mean streets, as I've tried to do, very briefly, against that dynamic in which the ethnic is so different from the racial, we might see race, ethnicity, and Harlem in more complicated ways. And the point I think we want to ask is about whether there's a Harlem aesthetics, and kind of what would that mean, right? The migrant, of course, is an important kind of figure to enter into the complex of new understandings of race and place. Perry Thomas's mother's longing for another place come into contact with her son's longings for America, which ultimately lays open the complicated desire for membership that has made Harlem. Embedded as the migrant may be in cross-cultural dialogues on the nature of multiplicity, again, Puerto Ricans and Italians coming into conflict over territory, he or she may show us something new. Perry Thomas walks the city and takes in experiences and uncovers connections that an urban planner might not always be able to do. Part of that process involves moving through neighborhoods and those neighborhoods' national articulations, vis-a-vis Italy, Puerto Rico, or the United States. Implicit but undeniable is the relationship between countries that are unequal on the world stage. In a name, imperialism. Migration, not only from one country to another, creates then a new interaction of places. The navigation of cultures, this is to say, does not only play out between nation states, but countries of experience within what might seem to be a kind of local or parochial space, such as Harlem. Here, Spanish and Black Harlem powerfully come together and result in a more densely constituted and global space. Of course, the contact implied by such encounters is always conflictual. In more recent years, Perry Thomas has had many opportunities to reflect on the themes of Down These Mean Streets. In a response to a question about Puerto Rican identity, Thomas almost screams to the interviewer, quote, "I felt both Puerto Rican and black, you understand? And yet there was a little part of me that was white too. There was a Puerto Rican woman who was married to a black doctor, Dr. Barrows, and sitting one day in her house, she looked at me and said, 'Ay bendito, Piri, te vamos a perder.' Oh, what a pity, Piri, we are losing you." She meant that culturally, and it shook me. I was shaking. I was ready to become an American black, and yet I knew that I was not fully accepted by the blacks. I sensed that also when I was a member of the Harlem Writers Guild." End quote. Thomas's desire for blackness does not necessarily or always mean that he is black, precisely because race and racialization are complex historical processes. Here, too, migrancy has a number of implications. Even though the experience of migration was one that structured the development of all of African American, Puerto Rican, Italian, and other communities, it did so in very different ways. Migration has always been pitted against native racialization, both in terms of the state's management of actual populations and political discourse, and also in the combustibility of immigrants and African Americans living side by side with one another in U.S. cities. And a certain exceptionalism is claimed too, as the white ethnic distances himself from a racialized and class space. And this is, there's a very long, complicated history of Italians in Harlem, and sort of this move from, particular forms of racialization to whiteness, right? Thomas's parents leaving Harlem, they go to Long Island, must be read in this respect too. Contemporary claims to space in East Harlem, particularly voiced by Puerto Ricans vis-a-vis Mexican residents now, oddly evoke Italian hostility to Puerto Rican migrants arriving in the 1940s. And if you talk to people, there's a kind of sometimes an interesting lack of self-consciousness about ways that these discourses are really similar. Cross-cultural moves then hardly supersede race, though they certainly reimagine it. 2 years before Perry Thomas published his book, the world saw another powerful image of cross-cultural encounter. In an iconic Life magazine photograph of Malcolm X's assassination at the Audubon Ballroom, there was a petite Asian woman holding Malcolm's head as he was dying. This woman was Yuri Kochiyama, a former Japanese internee, civil rights activist, and Harlem resident for much of her adult life. If the visual coming together of Blackness and Asianness spectacularized the depth of solidaristic racial feeling associated with civil rights at this historical moment, it also expressed on a more micro level the kinds of intimacies that could take shape in the space of Harlem. And as it turns out, in Yuri Kochiyama's 126th Street apartment as well. The broad circulation of this image through generations of certainly less populous Asian American radical activist formations and multiracial coalitions against the intelligence apparati of the nation state are tied to ideas about the place of Harlem in political narratives that are at once conscious of and transcending its geographical boundaries. Remembrances of this moment, processed through the photograph of Kochiyama and a dying Malcolm X, often function in the service of claims to a more cosmopolitan sensibility, beyond identity politics about race, and therefore about Harlem as well. On the back cover of Kochiyama's 2004 memoir, Passing It On, is a photograph of the author in front of a sign for the 125th Street subway station. The framing image of Kochiyama on Harlem's most famous street is symptomatic of her self-presentation as someone whose life story is deeply tied up with the space of Harlem. But Harlem in this narrative does not function in any simplistic way as a kind of shorthand for blackness or radicality. Instead, Harlem is a vehicle for cross-cultural political encounter that Kochiyama values from the very early part of her life. Kochiyama describes her apartment in Harlem as a meeting point for activists of many a political and racial stripe who are coming and going. She talks about how the Freedom Riders, as she's quick to put it, an interracial group of activists, met at her house. And she is proud of a home visit from Malcolm X and his subsequent written correspondence with her. Harlem for Kochiyama is a political space, as well as one of blackness. She notes with pleasure that her children were, quote, influenced by the different aspects of Afro-American culture, its music, its dance, its literature, and its sports figures. It was the best place to raise Billy, Audi, Aichi, Eddie, Jimmy, and Tommy. Harlem was a university without walls. But importantly, Kochiyama sees the cultural transfers as almost organic and remarkably easy. Never do we as readers feel the marks of otherness, that sense of tourism, of the exotic or the unrecognizable or the inscrutable. And she may even err a little bit in the sense of ease. I asked her at some point at a public talk about whether there was anything kind of uncomfortable about being an Asian woman in the streets of Harlem in the 1960s. She said, no, nothing ever. I walked the streets and no one bothered me. They just said hello and smiled broadly. And it's an interesting kind of, she has a deep investment in this and in this way that she inhabited Harlem. Neither does she nor Piri Thomas seek in Harlem anonymity. Nor does either of these subjects attest to the losing of self or the shedding of history. So Yuri Kochiyama is very conscious of the fact that she was a Japanese internee, and she lived in Harlem, and she sort of brought a range of politics together in her life and it kind of in her place in Harlem. If Kochiyama has affiliated with Harlem and its politicized struggles over race, it is a solidarity then that cannot be decoupled from her experience as a political internee. The contrast between, on the one hand, her mobility being actually literally constrained by the state, and on the other hand, the possibility of moving and becoming part of a new place, renders Harlem full of promise, offering mobility and thus a kind of freedom. Kochiyama finds a self there, just as Thomas and others before them have. Despite being prescribed by geography and even race, Harlem, in these cases, as a social symbolic space, is remarkably open. To end, I'd like to offer a note of caution in being too romantic about cross-cultural encounters while also asking us to be alive to their possibilities. We might think about the now historic event of former President Bill Clinton deciding to have his office on 125th Street in Harlem, and the debates that ensued about streets, belonging, and all sorts of mobility. When Clinton arrived, the new Black Panther Party said in response, "Harlem is ours. We will not allow some cracker named Bill Clinton to set the stage and the pace to drive black people out of Harlem." Others were more positive. Cheryl Babson, a Grenadian immigrant from Brooklyn, said, quote, "He's a part of me now." And Henry Murray, an older resident, said, "Clinton's a regular homeboy. It doesn't matter if he's from Arkansas. This is America." There are competing ideas about dwelling in these coats and various other opinions about the move. To the question of whether Bill Clinton can become member, citizen, or inhabitant of the space of Harlem, some say yes, as the racial ontologies refigured to allow for Bill Clinton becoming black. In these responses, astonishingly, while territorial legitimacy is held to be constituted by something called blackness, that blackness can be conferred flexibility. Of course, in the case of the nationalism of the new Black Panther Party, the limits of subjectivity and place definition are more finely drawn. Whiteness in that rhetoric is a form of otherness and constructs another vision of territory. So that Bill Clinton is, sort of fast forward a little bit. So the President, Bill Clinton is representative of the sorts of gentrification that are also being struggled over. Clinton awakens national longings and also a desire for local belonging. He quite eagerly draws upon a story of blackness that, set against other historical understandings, appears parochial rather than cosmopolitan, and in so doing, he really shrinks social space to correspond to a highly localized geography. His proclaimed familiarity with African Americans through U.S. white Southern experience is the ground in which his claims to Harlem are embedded. If the route to intimacy seems, at the very least, a bit too simplistic, it also foregrounds a reading of place that cannot begin to approach the complexity of interaction and symbolic potential that many might argue make Harlem a sign for modern life. Regardless of what we think about Clinton, the encounter, the cross-cultural move, cannot be undone. As one news article queried at the time of Clinton's arrival, quote, "When, if ever, has the most famous person on the most famous black street in America, 125th Street in Harlem, Martin Luther King Boulevard, been white?" Well, perhaps not with the drama of Bill Clinton. But cross-cultural encounters have not only always taken place on Harlem streets, but have, in many important ways, shaped social life there. The challenge that faces all of us who work on and are invested in the future of Harlem is how to develop a political language and movement that describes the multiple claims on the place and encourages the participation of many very different kinds of communities. And yes, visions of place most certainly collide. When Perry Thomas presses Rocky, that sort of Italian kid with whom he is having a turf conflict, to see the Harlem Hospital and thus the area of Harlem as multiply constituted with more cosmopolitan content, he says, with a kind of utopian air, quote, "There's all kinds of people born there, colored people, Puerto Ricans like me, and even spaghetti benders like you." Rocky replies with words and force, "That's a dirty lie. Bash." I felt Rocky's fist smack into my mouth. Quote, "You dirty fucking spick." Thomas's mean streets, avenues for mobility and navigation all the same, were deeply fought over. It is that sense of dwelling, too, that faces all those who seek to move within and through its borders. Thanks.
Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions. Or comments and questions.
Oh, yes.
So, one thing about this university is like a lot of talk about becoming a global university, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just like multicultural in the United States sense. So I wonder, I don't know how much you know about those efforts, but if you could like relate the language around Columbia being a global university to the kind of cosmopolitanism you just talked about and illustrated, and what kind of overlaps or contradictions you might see between
That's a good question.
especially as that global university seeks to move into.
Sure. That's a very, very good question. Well, there's so many ways to break it down. I mean, I think first we really have to grapple with what it means for something to be global and the various different ways that that term is utilized. And I think you're actually touching, I have a sense that you're sort of touching on some of them even in your question, which is that, one way global can be understood is in terms of the imperial, right? In terms of something that is capturing many kinds of difference, right? Harnessing many kinds of difference and making it whole, right? There's a sense of the global that's about the world, right? And that sense of global being about the world again is something that we want to break down and think through more carefully, because if you think about entry into the world stage, it's never about equality. Right? Different countries enter onto the world stage, become a part of the global on deeply unequal footing. Right? So I wonder if, to some extent, we want to find a way to retain a sense of connection and diversity while also attending to the fact that there is difference. Right? Difference in power, difference in relationships. And, I think that in many ways the jury is out on whether the term global can do all of that at once. Right? I think that one of the challenges and pleasures of this project is about developing a kind of sensibility about cosmopolitanism, the sort of sense of people, many different sorts of peoples interacting, that is really sort of really attends closely to difference and inequality. And in what I was trying to describe in terms of these figures, Perry Thomas and Yuri Kochiyama, as cosmopolitan and invested in cross-cultural moves, is that they were also deeply attendant to difference and inequality, and they sort of had a kind of politics around solidarity, around racial solidarity, that was part of what they understood as, in Thomas's sense of the mundo, or in Yuri Kochiyama's sense of all these international struggles, that seemed to her to be talking to one another, right? And there's a lot about her that I can say more about, but I don't think always that. I guess the short answer to the question that those two ideas of, kind of the global and the sort of cosmopolitan that I'm talking about, this sort of relationship between different forms of otherness in a place and of a place, and sort of really responding to the kinds of needs and desires of many different kinds of communities that are also similarly disenfranchised, are compatible, right? Is that get at some of it? I think you had a second part of that question.
wondering if, I guess the power question really gets at what I've been thinking about, especially in the like thinking about who is actually in the positions of power for articulating each kind of vision, and what kind of communication or lack of communication happens between that, but then who has the power to enact their vision versus who doesn't.
I think that's very, very true. And I would add to that, I mean, who is defining what is global, right? I mean, I think, too, that there is, I touched on this a little bit, that there can be, in some of these responses to political struggles around gentrification, the sense that people in Harlem don't really understand, kind of what it might be to have a kind of diverse place, or to have Harlem be global and kind of multicultural. And what I'm trying to kind of uncover and accentuate with the sorts of moments, I'm interested in, I'm describing, I'm reading, and kind of writing about, is that there is a sense of kind of cosmopolitanism built into the place. Right? That it's not something that needs to be. It's something actually that a range of peoples actually already understand, even as they are saying, your vision of what is global, right, is not our vision of what is global, right? In a kind of argument against particular plans for gentrification, to just speak of one example, right?
I'm not sure I'm understanding the difference between cross-cultural and multicultural. Do you mind?
Sure. Well, I think partly, it's a question of emphasis. I think people have used multicultural in a range of very important and useful ways, and as well as using cross-cultural. But in terms of some of the effects of multiculturalism that I see as problematic, they are the ways in which multiculturalism presumes that the differences within the kind of larger rubric are discrete and kind of whole unto themselves, right? That you sort of have these groups of people that are sort of very kind of clearly defined, again, discretely defined, and that sort of that there and that there's a sense that there's almost a kind of homogeneity within those groupings, right? It really stresses, I think, it stresses the total production of difference of discrete differences within a larger rubric. Now, what I see as cross-cultural is and there's I can kind of say more about who kind of I'm interested in. One of the theorists that I find really useful for thinking about the cross-cultural is Wilson Harris, who's a literary critic and a novelist and essayist, and from Guyana, who's really interested in the ways that differences come in contact with one another, and in effect then become something new. So there's this sense that there's something actually productive about encounter and interaction. So the emphasis is on the crossing, the kind of the meeting points and sort of what happens. And the reason I see that as really useful is because it has this kind of productive edge, right? That something new, something political, something cultural can come about when differences come into contact with one another. And I think it also, there's more to say about the ways that he and other theorists and scholars develop this notion of the cross-cultural, but there's also the sense that difference is not static or stable. It's on the move. It's internally inconsistent or heterogeneous. That there's something about sort of the quality of an identification or of a community or of a group and how this group understands itself, that is mobile, that sort of is moving. It's dynamic. And that's why in terms of understanding, this space of Harlem, I found the cross-cultural to be so helpful for understanding, kind of what's happening on the borders, right? What's happening not just on the borders of, Spanish Harlem and Black Harlem, but on the borders between different communities within Black Harlem, or on the borders between different communities within Spanish Harlem. And then, kind of when those sort of groups come into contact with one another, what happens? Something new sometimes emerges, something conflictive emerges, sometimes something intimate emerges, something solidaristic emerges. So it seems to me that that it's important to think about this place of Harlem as dynamic, and the term cross-cultural, the concept of the cross-cultural, has been helpful in kind of illuminating some of that in ways that other terms haven't, particularly the multiculturalism. But I also understand that multiculturalism has been really useful, and at various historical moments has generated a whole range of critical discourses that are meaningful. And I certainly don't want to caricature it, but I'm sort of looking at this particular place and trying to think of ways to see sort of what's happening on the edges in new ways.
I'm kind of curious to know why you don't think multiculturalism is as productive as cross-culturalism. Because almost in my mind, I almost think of, I'm kind of a very abstract thinker, so I just don't understand myself sometimes, but in terms of multiculturalism, I almost feel like that's almost a product of cross-culturalism in a way, you know what I mean? Those interactions and what's being produced out of that. And so I'm kind of interested to hear your perspective on the use of multiculturalism and why it may or may not be productive.
Well, I mean, I'd be interested to know what you think about it too, and sort of what you think about the ways in which it's been productive. I guess one of the difficulties I have with multiculturalism has to do with the way that it's been used by various projects of the liberal nation state to contain difference, and also in some sense to kind of gloss over inequality. It has, I mean, I think in certain sorts of discourses, and again, it's both kind of, it does get sort of quite abstract at moments, but I think in some of the political effects of the liberal state using multiculturalism, there's a way in which it becomes celebratory, right? Rather than conducive to a kind of deeper inquiry into, inequality and power differentials, right? And I think that there has been, politically, there have been productive things about multiculturalism in the sense of, or sort of even the multicultural state, if you want to call it, in the ways that political interests have developed, on the basis of, kind of racial and ethnic interests. And I think that that's really important to kind of understand. I mean, I think that to sort of throw multiculturalism, out the window would be to sort of in some ways not acknowledge that's still very important, to have those sort of interests, that are based in these kind of perhaps discrete differences. But I'm not sure that it is able to really speak to something that I think we all face today in really important ways, which is internal differentiation. On the one hand, internal differentiation, in these groups, right? And the ways in which, contemporary urban landscapes are becoming more and more kind of about interaction, among all sorts of differences. So where it's becoming, it can become quite difficult to identify, one difference sort of over the other, and that's why I love that that moment where Priyatama is screaming to the interviewer. You get the sense of this is a very difficult thing to have heard, which is I'm Puerto Rican and black. Can't you understand? And I think that moment is very much about that particular, and it's a particular historical moment when he's being interviewed about that not being able to be readily understood, that you can inhabit both of those identificatory spaces at once, right?
Right. This has to be the last question, whoever you want to recognize.
I'm particularly interested in the part that you read about Thomas and the Italian kid, and how at such a young age he was already aware of his multiple identities racially, and how he was willing to explore them at such a young age, and how this Italian kid, also raised in Harlem, was unable to accept the possibility of that. And so I was really interested in what do you think living in Harlem, how that impacted identity development among those children, or among their parents, in such a way that they would influence their children to say that it's Italian or it's nothing, how those two boys living a few blocks away could end up with such very different racial ideologies at such a young age.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think it is many things, right? And I think the sort of I think what you're suggesting is right, that the beauty of that kind of narrative moment is that both possibilities, right, are present, right? On the one hand, the sense of multiple identifications and powerful impulses to blackness, to Puerto Ricanness, to immigrantness, right? And Rocky's kind of sense of Italianness and turf, right? At the same time, and I think that life in Harlem produces both of those things, right, and more, right? I think that, and it's a sort of a longer story, I think, of how people relate to territory, right, and sort of moments in which territory does become ethnicized or racialized in a particular way, and this correspondence between place and race is very, very tight, and moments when it can be tight, but the sort of the sense of identification actually can be a little bit more open or a little bit more multiple. And I have to say that part of what I've been really interested in terms of this larger project of thinking about Harlem as cross-cultural is really trying to understand both the kind of sort of racial relationship to territory, and also opening it up, but not opening it up in a way that suggests, well, anything goes, right? So it's a kind of it's a fine line to tread, I think, actually.
That's right. Let's give Professor Shukla another round of applause.